Welcome to the video, folks. In this particular one, what I'm going to focus on is some checks that you can undertake of your motorcycle before you take it on a track day, before you race it, before you take it to a school, riding school, superbike school, or something like that. But also some checks that you can periodically undertake of your motorcycle before you take it out on the street for a range ride or something like that. The goal is ultimately to be safe and make sure the machine is in the correct operational condition. Now, these 10 checks, then I'll tell you they can be broken into two parts. There's the easy stuff, which is just a simple visual check. Might involve just touching something or checking something with your hand, but very easy to fix or correct. Then there's the more technical checks, and these are the ones that would involve a simple check, but to correct them, it might require some sort of adjustment or even taking it to the workshop to get fixed. Number one, throttle return. Let's make sure the throttle, when you crank it on and you let go of it, it immediately returns to zero. It rolls the throttle off. There's nothing more dangerous than a motorcycle that the rider has fallen off and the throttle is jammed on. You would have seen videos of motorcycles running down the track at a zillion miles an hour or spinning around in circles on its side because the throttle has been jammed on. Right, extremely dangerous to people around, but also pretty bad for your piece of equipment. So wouldn't be unusual to blow up the engine or something like that if that were the case. So let's make sure those throttle returns return to zero. Second one, check the oil filler cap. Make sure it is tight. Never ceases to amaze me how many times I check a motorcycle while scrutineering at the Superbike School and find the oil filler cap is actually loose. So if you're going to race the motorcycle, you'll need to wire those on. But for me, I'm going to wire it on anyway, because if the oil filler cap comes off, oil's going to come out, it's going to get blown backwards onto the rear tyre, and you're probably going to crash the motorcycle, in addition to putting oil on the bitumen, which is going to affect other people. Third one, tyre pressures. Now, there's a zillion pieces of information out there about tyre pressures. You know, what do you actually run? So I'm kind of going to leave it up to you to what you run. Keep in mind that tyre pressures are affected by, the settings that you would choose are affected by the type of tyre you're running, whether it's a slick or a Pirelli or a Metzler or something like that, the conditions you're riding in, whether it's wet or dry, the type of tarmac you're riding on, is it grippy, is it coarse, is it fine, the settings of your motorcycle, the way that you ride the motorcycle itself, your weight. There's going to be a zillion factors that affect the pressure settings that are going to be optimal for that particular tyre. So the easiest way to approach this is, listen, if you're going to go to a racetrack and you don't know what settings to use, then here's a good starting point, right? What I would do is put 32 psi front cold in a road race tyre, something like a Metzler Race Tech, and 26 to 28 psi cold in the rear. So in that vicinity, you know, 32-32, 32-30, 32-28, or something like that is going to be a pretty good starting point for you. And there's a zillion pieces of information out there about tyre pressures, but there's also a lot of good information out there about how you check your tyre pressures when they're hot while you're on the track and that type of thing. So I'll leave that up to you. At least check the tyre pressures. Fourth thing, fork seals. The easiest way to check the fork seals is a visual look at the front. Make sure that there's no visible oil or leaks or rings left behind from the compression movement, which would indicate you've got a leak. And then what I do is I run my finger around the back of the seal just to make sure I can't see any oil in my finger. It's one of those things that's going to occur to your motorcycle at some point in time just through natural wear and tear, but can also be accelerated as a problem by getting dents in the fork leg and the fork tube. So fork seals, got to check those. They are a game changer. You're not going to be allowed on track if you've got fork seal issues. The fifth thing in the easy stuff is actually to check the grips are actually gripped or gripping onto the clip-ons or the throttle and that type of thing. Again, it's one of these things that you find quite frequently, that someone comes in and the grips, they've replaced the grips, they haven't done a very good job of putting them on there, they haven't glued them on or wired them on, and the grips actually move. They slide in, they slide out, they can jam the throttle, or they can come off even. So you need to check those. And if you've ever seen a superbike, you'll see that one of the checks that they have is that the grips are wired on. So they glue them and wire them on properly. If you have grips like are on this BMW S1000RR, then those things just are never going to move. They come as part of a tube that is, I think it's got some sort of super glue in there. Like I said, they don't even move. First one is one of the things that probably surprises people, certainly surprises people when I point it out, and that is the axle pinch bolts at the front. These are the bolts that actually hold the little pinch areas that squeeze and grip the front axle, that hold your front wheel on. Now, it's not uncommon for someone to get a front wheel tyre change. They replace, they're rushing or they're distracted or something like that. They replace the tyre, put the axle bolt in, tighten up the axle bolt, forget to tighten or tension properly the axle pinch bolts. So I would always recommend you invest in a torque wrench. For me, this is one of the things that I check with a torque wrench every single time before I go on track to make sure that these things are pinched, because you can imagine if they're loose, then it's starting to compromise the security of or the safety at the front end of the motorcycle. Now, the axle pinch bolts on the BMW S1000, the recommended torque of these particular, or tensioning of these particular bolts, is 19 Newton meters. And the way they recommend you do it is do it 6 times in rotation by loosening and tensioning and rotate around. 6 times they talk about it. And the reason for that is you want to make sure that they're all tensioned correctly, and that's only done when every other one is tensioned correctly. And the only way to do that is to do them multiple times. Okay, the other one, and it relates to this, is very close to the front end, and that is the caliper bolts that hold the front brake caliper on. If you are racing a motorcycle, you are required to wire those on. So, you would simply get those titanium pre-drilled bolts from ProBolt or someplace like that, and then you would put the twisty wire in, but you'd also tension those. So you need to check these, make sure they're tight. If you have a torque wrench, tension them correctly. I know the M10 bolts that we've got on the BMW S1000, they are tensioned to 38 Newton meters, and again, that is something that is worth checking. The third thing, the chain tension. Now, this is one of the things that often comes up, probably more frequently than anything else. The chains are often over-tensioned on the bikes that we scrutineer at the Superbike School. They come in, right, the bike's sitting on its side stand, so it's got the weight of the bike applied to the motorcycle, to the suspension, and the rear chain is tight. And it never ceases to amaze me how many times it has come that way to the rider from a workshop. Now, the reality of it is this. When you get on that motorcycle, right, so the rider's weight alone is going to compress the suspension. And what that's effectively going to do is lengthen the swing arm, because the swing arm is going to swing up, right? It's going to change the dynamics of it because of the way the different hinges and the pivot points are located in respect to the chain itself, and it puts tension or more tension on the chain. So if it's already tight, it's going to put a lot more tension on a tight chain. Now, you get out on the track, you go around a corner, as you're cornering, it's going to compress even more, and it's going to put even more tension on that chain, and it's going to overstretch it. So that's one of the problems. You want about 40 to 50 mil of slack in that chain, a bit of play, when the bike is sitting on a side stand with the weight only of the motorcycle applied to the suspension. In the journal or the manual for the S1000RR, they talk about 45 to 50 mil. In fact, it's written on the side of the swing arm. So make sure the chain tension has sufficient play in it that you're not going to over-tension it when you go around riding that motorcycle. Fourth thing, brake pads. Real easy visual check. Most of them have a little groove in the pad, which is a wear mark indicator. When the groove disappears in the middle of the pad, then you need to replace those pads. Make sure you've got a set of brake pads that's going to last at least the duration of the ride. The final thing is the steering head. The way you check the steering head bearing is to apply the front brake and then put force forward and backwards on the motorcycle. So basically what you're trying to do is move the motorcycle backwards and forwards with the brake applied. And if there's any wear or problems with the steering head bearing, it will appear as movement in the steering head. And if you find that in the motorcycle, you've got to take that in and get it fixed. That's something that is dangerous. It means you've got a bearing that has failed or something like that, and the security or safety of that motorcycle is compromised. So that's about it. Okay, 10 checks, throttle return, oil filler cap tightness, check your tyre pressures. Obviously you're going to make sure you've got good tyres on it. Check your fork seals aren't leaking, check the grips aren't moving on the clip-ons. Axle pinch bolts, make sure they're tightened. The caliper bolts that hold the front brake calipers on, make sure they're tight. In a perfect world, you're going to tension those two things. The third thing, chain tension, make sure it's got slack in there, 40 to 50 millimeters of slack. Brake pads, sufficient brake pads that are going to last the duration of the ride. And the final thing is the steering head. So that's it from me. Check your bike, make sure it's in good condition, and I'll see you on track or out there on the ranges. Have fun.